Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I'm Amy Witherden. With me in the studio I have Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa to discuss the nationalisation of mines in South Africa. Welcome, Ebrahim.
Hi, thanks.
There's been a lot of talk about the nationalisation of mines recently. President Jacob Zuma stated clearly in Parliament that nationalisation is not government policy, but the ANC Youth League seems determined that this will happen in the not-too-distant future. So now, while the debate has become overly politicised, can you explain what nationalisation actually entails?
Well, Amy, nationalisation is a word which I think there's a lot of sentimental and to a degree even principled attachment to, particularly amongst people who supported and some who continue to support the ANC. But it is also a very vexing term, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different peoples. At the most basic level, nationalisation is firstly in contradistinction to privatisation. It's the other end of the scale, so to speak. So while privatisation on the one hand means something, an entity, a thing, a business, an operation, which is completely and wholly privately owned. You could make up that private ownership through different shareholders, different people, but it is essentially in private hands. Nationalisation on the other end of the spectrum is an entity, an operation, a business, a thing, which is publicly owned either through a state or a government. Now, there's an important distinction when something is owned by the state, which means that there's very little chance that if there's a change in government, that ownership of that state-owned enterprise or a state-owned entity would by and of itself change because there's a change in government. Because states, we know, are durable over time, they exist in perpetuity, they don't end. Governments have terms which end, and governments can potentially change. And if something is government-owned, it can potentially change over ownership if a new government comes into place. It has all sorts of practical considerations, but potentially it can change. So there is a subtle distinction. But nationalisation is, in brief, an entity, operation, business, a thing which is owned entirely by a government or a state, which then makes it something which you could say is publicly owned. But when you talk about something which is publicly owned, you must ask the question of what is the purpose of public ownership? What is the purpose of a state or a government ownership of a particular thing? And what end, what goal, what objective does it seek to serve when it's owned by that government? So I think that's the broad primary definition of what nationalisation is. Ownership by a public through state or through government.
So in principle and now globally speaking, is nationalisation feasible?
Well, that again, it depends who you ask. Clearly, 2 years ago, if you asked the British government whether nationalisation was feasible, they indeed did think it was. And nationalisation was also thought feasible in a country, wholly unexpectedly, of course, the United States of America. And when the global financial crisis hit, of course, a bank in the United Kingdom, Northern Rock, which went through a woeful period, it was almost on the brink of collapse, and it had to be nationalised. But of course, there was a serious question about what the role and purpose of Northern Rock was. It was a bank which was extending home loans on credit to a whole lot of people. It had run into trouble and run into problems because it had extended credit fairly irresponsibly and had, of course, borrowed far too much on the capital markets to be able to extend credit. And when their own borrowings, they were not able to service those loans, and in turn people who were owing Northern Rock the money weren't able to service their loans, you had this double jeopardy, and the British government had to step in. But of course they did so in a very time-bound and time-specific period. They set out a time frame in which there would be this transitional process of public ownership of Northern Rock through the British government, be bailed out by the Treasury, and that when market conditions improve, of course they would think about setting the ownership of Northern Rock back to private hands. So it's very time specific, it's very time bound, and it's linked to a very particular purpose. So, you know, the idea that nationalization is in and of itself, in principle, a bad thing, is an ideological debate. And in South Africa at the moment, it appears as if people are wedded ideologically in principle, either for nationalization or anti-nationalization. And if we talk in such broad terms, it's not necessarily going to be helpful, because there are many, theoretically at least speaking, and conceptually speaking, nationalization can in fact be a very good thing, provided that there are sufficient oversight, accountability, ownership and redistributionary mechanisms built in to the way in which a nationalized asset is going to work.
Where has nationalization been successfully implemented?
Well, if you look at some of the social democratic countries, at least in Europe, and one thinks of the Nordic countries which immediately spring to mind, and let's take a country like Norway, which has fairly extensive oil reserves. That Statoil, the oil company in Norway, is generally publicly owned. There's of course some concessions for private owners and operators, which, and they built in certain management contracts where people or private entities take responsibility for running certain functions within the overall company. But the revenues and the proceeds that have come from that oil company is actually distributed across the populace, and some recent calculations seem to suggest that what the proceeds have allowed that society and that country to do is allow literally every Norwegian citizen to have a pension of worth close to 1 million kroner in their currency. So clearly there's an example of a very efficient, a very effective process of national ownership, but with sufficient safeguards of oversight, of accountability of what happens to the revenues and the proceeds, that the redistributionary impulse built into that process of national ownership is distributed equitably, relatively equitably across the society, and it does benefit the public generally and overall. But here we are talking about very practical dimensions of the fact that, number one, it's a small society, number two, it's relatively homogeneous, the kind of social cleavages are not as deep and stark in that society, they have high level skills that they can call upon, the spatial spread of the society is relatively small, so transport, logistics, supply chain are very easy to manage. Of course it can get complex, but on a scale compared to South Africa or a larger country, it is relatively easier to do those things. They also then can call upon fairly high-level skills, both in finance, in administration and elsewhere, and their ability to raise money on capital markets for equipment, for plant, to pay labor, to do all sorts of things, to basically operate the business is fairly easy. So we have to ask very serious questions about the fact that while there are examples of relative success in some parts of the world, are those successes necessarily transferable to South Africa? Is the economy of scale, is the scale of efficiencies, are those possible in South Africa? And if we look at our data at the moment, it doesn't appear that that is the case. If we talk about the nationalization of mines, essentially what we're talking about is this thing goes into public ownership. Then we must look at what is the trust and the confidence that South Africans have in public institutions at the moment. And at the moment,
not much.
It is very low. Lots of data seems to be suggesting that public trust, and that is the trust that institutions will do the right thing, is very low. If we measure something called confidence in public institutions, that is confidence that the institution and the organization will function effectively, efficiently, according to the principles of its establishment and its articles of association, that confidence is also fairly low. So where trust and confidence are both low, public perceptions of what national assets can do will suffer concomitantly. And it's true so far for all the state-owned enterprises that we have. They are not necessarily nationalized, so to speak, but they are publicly owned. And in every instance, whether it be the public broadcaster, whether it be transport, rail, road, whether it be electricity, in any of those areas, public trust and public confidence is fairly low. Even if we take this out of the realm of public perceptions of trust and confidence and we look at performance on an objective basis, it is also equally woeful. So the idea that we will have nationalization of mines and that they will necessarily be a panacea for reducing levels of inequality and levels of poverty is something which exists in the theoretical realm. Practically, that may in fact not be the case. Does that mean that we should argue against nationalization? I'm not convinced that that's the case. What I do think we need to do is enter a debate which is going to be more well informed, which is going to take all the dimensions of the problem into account and see whether that would then be workable or not.